My name is Jordan, and today I am ranking the top 100 albums on RateYourMusic.com. This is a video I've wanted to make ever since I made my original video 4 years ago ranking the top singles on this site, but I put it off for so long because I knew it would be such a massive undertaking. I also knew that if I were to make the video, I wanted to do it right, and I wanted to re-listen to every single album on the list. Before I started listening for this video, I'd already heard 81 of the 100 albums, but I wanted to make sure that this video had my most up-to-date opinions. I have some other stuff I want to quickly get through, but if you want to just get to the ranking, the timestamp is in the description. This has been a long journey to get to this point. I started listening for this video last November, and as I record this, it is currently July. I really wanted to make sure that I took my time with this and wasn't rushing through these because I wanted to appreciate every single album the best I could. I also wanted to be in front of the camera for this video because I did really want to emphasize just how subjective this video is. I've spent a lot of time on this, and at the end of the day, it is just my personal ranking of these albums. If you want a more objective and universal list, you can just go on RateYourMusic.com and look at the list yourself. As with the singles list, these are 100 of the most beloved albums in online music spaces, so there are going to be opinions in here that do annoy you. Some things had to fall near the bottom, even albums I really enjoy. It was difficult to make this list, and I knew there was no point in trying to make everyone happy, so this is just my opinion. I'll also indicate my first listens with a star in the top right corner, and I've also noted my 3 favorite tracks on each album. This was mainly just a way to keep me more engaged with listening, so don't put too much stock in it if I don't include your favorite track. Finally, I'll be including some albums that I think should be on the list after the ranking, so stick around if you want to watch that. And without further ado, let's get into the ranking. Something was always gonna have to be at the bottom of the list. While I do enjoy the vast majority of the albums on here, there are a few at the bottom that did not do anything for me. And unfortunately, at number 100, I have Metallica's Master of Puppets. For as heavy and loud as this album is, I was just surprised in how bored I got and how quickly that happened. There are some interesting and progressive passages here, but the majority of the tracks ended up falling flat for me just due to how monotonous it got and how much this is also just not my style of music. To get this out of the way while we make it through the bottom of this list, metal is one of the only genres I struggle with enjoying. There are metal records out there that I like, and I'm generally a fan of heavier music, but this style of metal, especially from this time period, does absolutely nothing for me. And with Master of Puppets, despite the influence and clear talent on display, I just did not enjoy this one at all. My favorite tracks were Master of Puppets, Disposable Heroes, and Leper Messiah. At 99, I have to give it to Symbolic by Death, which I found marginally more enjoyable than Master of Puppets, mainly just due to how intense it is. That being said, I have to say again that I did not feel much while listening to this, despite enjoying the occasional riff or feeling tense at certain points. I didn't hate this album by any means, and I genuinely feel like I'm in the wrong here, but it didn't click with me and I don't want to pretend that it did. My favorite tracks were Symbolic, Sacred Serenity, and 1000 Eyes. The next album on the list might be a surprise given how legendary it is, but I have to give it to Led Zeppelin 4. Back when I had my little progressive rock phase when I was 14, I remember enjoying this album and other Led Zeppelin albums quite a bit, but on re-listen, I found this to be a pretty miserable experience. There's some pretty stunning passages on this album, but what I did not remember is just how fucking annoying Jimmy Page's voice is. He sounds like a pig squealing all over the tracks here, and it really ruined the album for me. For the classic rock kids who are pissed right now, we still have 3 Pink Floyd albums to get to, so wait for those at least. My favorite tracks were Black Dog, Stairway to Heaven, and When the Levee Breaks. Next up, I have another old school metal record, and that is Master of Reality by Black Sabbath. I really don't have much to say about this Black Sabbath album, and the other one we'll get to soon, other than this just isn't for me at all. I don't feel energized when I listen to this album, it just kind of fades in the background for me. It's unfortunate because I know how legendary this album is, but it just does not gel with me at all. My favorite tracks were Sweet Lead, Orchid, and Lord of This World. At 96, I have another Metallica record, which is Ride the Lightning. I don't feel too differently about this album than I do with Master of Puppets, but I came away from it with a stronger impression just due to it feeling a bit more memorable. I didn't find this to be quite as tedious as Master of Puppets, and there are moments on here I genuinely enjoyed. There are fun riffs all over this, and in my opinion, just a greater sense of enjoyment. I have nothing to back this up with, but I found this to be less mechanical than Master of Puppets and a bit more free and fun. And while it's still very much not my thing, I did gain some enjoyment from this album. My favorite tracks were Ride the Lightning, Fade to Black, and The Call of Cthulhu. At 95, I have what will be one of my most controversial takes in this video, and that is In the Aeroplane Over the Sea by Neutral Milk Hotel. As a lover of indie music, indie rock, indie folk, all of that, I've been surprised every time I come back to this album at just how annoying I find it to be. I've tried to listen to this album probably like 10 times at this point, and every time I'm surprised at how much it just does not click for me. I think I can credit most of that to just not really being able to feel the emotion of it for whatever reason. And while some of the rock passages are genuinely interesting to listen to, I find the folkier passages to just not really work for me. Maybe one day this album will hit for me, but today is not that day. My favorite tracks were In the Aeroplane Over the Sea, Two-Headed Boy, and The Fool. Next up, I have the final metal record on this list, which is Paranoid by Black Sabbath. I don't have too much to say about this record that I didn't already say about Master of Reality, but I did find a few tracks on this to be a little more interesting. I get why this one is beloved, I just can't call myself a major fan of it. My favorite tracks were War Pigs / Luke's Wall, Electric Funeral, and Jack the Stripper / Fairies Wear Boots. Similar to In the Aeroplane Over the Sea, I have tried to listen to Soundtracks for the Blind by Swans multiple times, although with this album I literally never finished it until this listen. The 2-hour beast of an album is probably the most daunting one on this list, and I have a lot of respect for it. There are some really chilling passages, especially on the first disc, but this album becomes a real slog for me as soon as you get to the second disc. I appreciate an album that really goes for it like this one and incorporates all these different sounds and samples, and I totally get why this one is so beloved. It's apocalyptic and truly one of a kind, but I gain so little enjoyment while listening to it. I'm not the biggest Swans fan in the world, but I have heard their 2010 trilogy of albums, and I like all of them more than this one. Maybe this will click for me one day, especially if I listen to it in a context different than listening for this album, but for right now I can't place it any higher. My favorite tracks were I Was a Prisoner in Your Skull, Volcano, and Animus. At 92, I have Red by King Crimson. We're getting to a point on this list where I don't have much to say about these albums because I feel so neutral about them. I've already said it multiple times and I'll continue to say it through this video, but I completely understand the appeal of this album. It's progressive, it's jazzy, it's innovative, but for me none of that translates into an album that I really care about. I'm nothing against this album or the people that enjoy it, but I just don't find the music to be that captivating, unfortunately. My favorite track was One More Red Nightmare. Maybe the opinion I feel the worst about in this video is that I have a hard time getting into Miles Davis's music, and In a Silent Way is no exception. Jazz is already somewhat of a tough genre for me, and we'll get to some great jazz albums later in this video, but Miles Davis's albums are just unfortunately not for me. I'm in no way trying to claim anything against this album or the fantastic playing on it, but for me I just didn't find it to be all that interesting or evocative. At 90, I have the Doors self-titled album. When listening, I didn't expect this album to place as low as it did because it's a perfectly alright album to listen to, but as a whole, this left one of the smallest impressions on me out of all the albums here. I remember so little about this album despite listening to it not that long ago, and I just think there are more interesting psychedelic rock albums from this time. My favorite tracks were Soul Kitchen, Light My Fire, and I Looked at You. Next up, I have the first of 3 Bob Dylan albums on this list, and that is Blonde on Blonde. To get it out of the way, I am not a big fan of Bob Dylan's voice. I know that's the most lukewarm take of all time, especially from someone of my generation, but it is true, and it's what stops me from being able to fully get into his music. Blonde on Blonde, I think, stands as by far the least memorable of the 3 albums on this list, and all the positive things I can say about Bob Dylan's music apply far more to those 3 albums. It's a nice, if not somewhat tedious album that I just don't have much to say about. My favorite tracks were Visions of Johanna, I Want You, and Absolutely Sweet Marie. To get another super controversial opinion out of the way now, at 88 I have the self-titled album from the Velvet Underground and Nico. I have all the respect in the world for how ahead of its time and truly ballsy this record is, but I can't deny that it sounds like shit and I do not enjoy listening to it. I think it's incredible that an album that sounds like this one does is one of the most popular albums of all time. It reminds me of the film 28 Days Later, which is an incredibly popular horror movie, but the early 2000s digital cameras they shot it on makes it look like shit, or good, depending on how you look at it. Similarly, there's a beauty to how rigid and noisy this album sounds, but unfortunately I have the boring take that I just do not like how it sounds at all. Maybe I'll get it one day. My favorite tracks were Sunday Morning, Femme Fatale, and I'll Be Your Mirror. Another controversial one, at 87, I have Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. The Beatles are the only group who have 4 albums on this list, and for me, Sgt. Pepper's remains the most overrated. As we'll get to into this list, I am not the craziest about the Beatles. I am aware of how boring it is for a girl in her 20s to say that she doesn't care about what is widely considered the best and most popular band of all time. That being said, they made some really incredible music, and some of that does land on this album. Growing up, my dad told me that this was the best Beatles album, and I blindly believed him until I listened to it as a teenager and was severely underwhelmed. There are some absolute classics on here, and A Day in the Life is my favorite Beatles song of all time. But I just don't connect with the majority of the tracks here, unfortunately. Sorry to the Sgt. Pepper heads out there, I know I fucked up here. My favorite tracks were Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, and of course A Day in the Life. At 86, I have another Miles Davis album, Kind of Blue. I don't have much to say about this one in comparison to In a Silent Way. I found this one to be just a bit nicer and easier to listen to, but as a whole, it's still not really for me. My favorite track was Blue and Green. I did not expect David Bowie to land anywhere near this low on this list, but listening to Station for the first time was unfortunately a really underwhelming experience. Hearing he was coked out of his mind while making this album makes a lot of sense for me, because it just lacks the general beauty and cohesion of so many of his albums. It's perfectly nice to listen to, but it failed to leave an impression on me besides enjoying a few of the tracks. My favorite tracks were Station to Station, Golden Years, and TVC 15. Close to the Edge by Yes is up there for one of the albums on this list I remember listening to the least. I had to go back while writing this to remind myself of what this one even sounded like, and despite its clear lack of impression on me, I can still appreciate that it is a good album, especially for its time. It's genuinely epic and massive in scale, especially for its short runtime, and I liked it while it was on, I just didn't take much away from it. My favorite track was Close to the Edge. The final Miles Davis album on this list is Bitches Brew, which is by far the most psychedelic and experimental of the 3. It is a beast of an album that is so ambitious and remarkable, I can't believe I don't love it. I found this one to be pretty exhausting to get through, which is partially due to the near 2-hour runtime, but also just because of how strange it is. I do really want to go back to this one at some point because I think I was too intimidated by it to allow myself to just fully enjoy it. There are sections of this album that are incredibly enjoyable, but for right now, I'm going to leave it here and hope it clicks with me more in the future. My favorite track was Spanish Key. I stopped listening to Kanye West in 2022 following his initial run of anti-Semitism, which has only gotten far worse. I won't delve too deep into controversies with other artists because I think that's a whole nother conversation, but I do think it's worth noting that I hadn't listened to Kanye for about 2 years before revisiting the 3 albums he has on this list. I thought that time would allow me to fully understand the hype of My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, but unfortunately it did not. This is coming from someone who really loves Kanye's discography, especially his earlier stuff and the 2 albums that followed this one, but I just don't see how people can defend the second half of this album. There are some incredible highs on this album for me, but the last 5 tracks, including Runaway, which I've already covered in my Rate Your Music singles video, are a total fucking snooze fest for me, and it really kills the momentum of the album. This is the album in this section of the list that I have the most experience with because I've tried over and over again to appreciate what's so good about this album. Every time I listen to it though, I find that the beginning is excellent, but it really falls off by the end, which breaks down the grandiosity of it all. The Chris Rock skit at the end of Blame Game haunts my dreams. My favorite tracks were Dark Fantasy, Power, and Devil in a New Dress. At number 81, I have to give it up to Bob Dylan again with Highway 61 Revisited, which I think is perfectly fine. I found myself more captivated by songwriting on this album in comparison to Blonde on Blonde, and the tighter track list makes this a much more enjoyable listen for me. I think there's some fantastic highlights on this album, and it really does capture this era of folk music really well. I'm still not in love with it, especially Bob's voice, but I do like it overall. My favorite tracks were Like a Rolling Stone, Tombstone Blues, and Ballad of a Thin Man. Unfortunately, for number 80, I have to go with Jimi Hendrix' Electric Ladyland. This was one of the most intimidating albums to go into, not having heard it before, and I found myself enjoying it, but just getting tired of it pretty quickly. I can totally appreciate the jammy nature of this album, and I liked it more than the Doors' take on psych rock, but I found myself getting lost multiple times due to how washed out and truly psychedelic it all is. There's another Jimi Hendrix album on this list that, spoiler alert, I liked a lot more, and I've been trying to figure out what it is about this album that doesn't fully click with me. I still thought it was good overall with some great moments in it, but I think the whole thing was a little much for me. My favorite tracks were Little Miss Strange, Come On Let the Good Times Roll, and 1983, A Merman I Should Turn to Be. Before this list, I had never heard an album by The Smiths. It's fuck Morrissey till the day I die, and I just didn't have much interest in listening to The Smiths despite casually enjoying a song here and there. Having finally heard The Queen is Dead, I thought it was just alright. I was actually blown away by the title track of this album, and I started to wonder if I'd unfairly written off this band because of the atrocious nature of the frontman. But as the album went on, I just didn't feel that peak of excitement again. I think there are really pretty moments throughout this album, and I understand its importance in the landscape of indie rock. I just didn't love it, unfortunately. My favorite tracks were The Queen is Dead, The Boy with the Thorn in His Side, and There is a Light That Never Goes Out. Spiderland by Slint is a great example of an album that I admire far more than I actually enjoy. We'll get to maybe the most truly doomer album on this list soon, but Spiderland is a truly uncompromising album that is just not for me. It's dark, it's weird, it's consistently off-putting, but again, I can't say that I actually enjoyed listening to it. I'm fascinated by it and I respect the hell out of it, but it's just one that I can't see myself coming back to anytime soon. My favorite track was Nosferatu Man. At 77, I have F Sharp A Sharp Infinity by Godspeed You! Black Emperor. This is one of two Godspeed albums on this list, and I was spoiled now that there's quite a discrepancy for me between those two albums that's really hard for me to explain. With this album, I think it has an unmatchable atmosphere, but the builds and instrumental passages would later get refined and be so much more impactful on their next record. I like it as a whole. I think it's a good post-rock album that gets the job done. It's just not one that I return to very often. My favorite track was East Hastings. We are now at the true doomer album that I referred to before, and that is Death Consciousness by Have a Nice Life. I have never met anyone who likes this album and is mentally stable, and I think that says something. As someone who has dealt with depression very severely throughout the majority of my life, there was a point in high school where I really loved this album, but I couldn't listen to it too often because it was so overwhelming. Nowadays, I just don't think I'm at a place where I can fully appreciate this album because I don't want to buy into how pessimistic and dark it all feels. I'm trying to work on myself and be a more positive person, and I think because of that on this listen, I kind of deflected it completely. That's not to say I dislike this album because I think it's incredibly effective for what it's doing, and the opening track is one of the most beautiful ambient songs I've ever heard. The hour-and-a-half runtime filled with gloom and doom is just not always an easy listen for me. My favorite songs were A Quick One Before the Eternal Worm Devours Connecticut, Blood Hail, and Earth Mover. Continuing the trend of incredibly happy albums, at 75 I have Closer by Joy Division. I'd heard this album before in high school, but revisiting it, I didn't remember it being this fucking weird. It's such a strange rock album that really deconstructs the post-punk genre, so much so that it's crazy to me that this band eventually became New Order. There are glimpses of those danceable beats and synths throughout, but it just all feels off. There's such a strange atmosphere to it that's kind of indescribable, and while I don't personally love it, I do respect the hell out of it. My favorite tracks were A Means to an End, 24 Hours, and Decades. At 74, I have Pink Moon by Nick Drake. For years, I'd loved the song Place to Be without hearing the full album, and maybe it's the high expectations that song gave me, but I ended up feeling a little underwhelmed when I finally got around to listening to this album. It's a solid folk album that's very pretty and serene. I guess I just didn't fully click with it, especially deeper into the track list. It's an album that I have a hard time critiquing because it's clearly doing exactly what it set out to do. I just don't fully love it. I do think it deserves a re-listen in the future, and if my opinion changes massively, I'll say so in the comments. My favorite tracks were Pink Moon, Place to Be, and Things Behind the Sun. For context, I used to think incredibly highly of the Low End Theory by A Tribe Called Quest. I'm aware of how many people I've pissed off now, from metalheads to doomer rock fans to Miles Davis fans, and now classic hip-hop fans. As you'll see later in this list, I don't dislike 90s hip-hop, I just don't love A Tribe Called Quest. I think their best album is actually their comeback album because of the clear maturation and variety of sounds there. Because while I understand how important the Low End Theory is, I just don't love listening to it. The beats are definitely ahead of their time and the jazz samples are great, I just don't find the rapping on top of it to be all that interesting. As I was writing this and as I'm saying it now, I do genuinely feel like I'm in the wrong here, but I don't want to lie to you. I just feel like whenever I tuned into the lyrics, it was either insanely misogynistic, even for the time, or it just wasn't saying much of anything. All I'll say is I'm glad Georgie Porgy did not make the track list. My favorite songs were Vibes and Stuff, Jazz We've Got, and Scenario. At 72, it's Abbey Road by the Beatles. What the fuck can I even say about Abbey Road at this point other than I'm sorry for putting it at 72 on this list. We have two more great Beatles albums to get to, and while I like Abbey Road as a whole, it just doesn't leave that much of an impression on me. I think right now we're in the most controversial section of the list, and I'm aware of that because the next few are tough as well. But in the grand scheme of things, Abbey Road just doesn't do much for me. There's some lovely tracks on it for sure, but it's the least risky Beatles album from this era, and I've never been able to fully buy into the final medley of songs at the end of the album. It's a cool idea, I just don't love the individual tracks, and unfortunately I think as a whole, Abbey Road is not greater than the sum of its parts for me. My favorite tracks are Something, I Want You, She's So Heavy, and Because. At 71, I have In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson, which is the first album in the Rate Your Music Top 10 to be on this list. I'm aware of how important this album is, I just don't find the music to be that compelling. I still like it overall, but 2 of the 5 tracks on this album I could do without, and one of those is the longest track on the whole album. It's an album that's absolutely ahead of its time, but rarely do I actually feel much when I'm listening to it. My favorite track was Epitaph. I don't feel too differently about A Tribe Called Quest from Midnight Marauders than I do about the Low End Theory, but I do find the rapping and production to be a little more interesting. Unfortunately though, I think pretty much everything I said about the Low End Theory applies here, so I'm gonna move on before I get into too much trouble. My favorite tracks were Award Tour, We Can Get Down, and The Chase Part 2. At 69, I have John Coltrane's A Love Supreme. We're at a particularly hard place in this list because I like all these albums, but I have to find some way to justify putting them this low. I don't really have anything negative to say about A Love Supreme. I think it's a really solid jazz album and I can see why it's so beloved, but at the end of the day, there are other albums on this list I like a lot more. My favorite track was Part 2, Resolution. At 68, I have the final Bob Dylan album on this list, and that is Blood on the Tracks. This is actually the only Bob Dylan album I had heard before making this video, and I'm surprised that it came out on top because I didn't love it on first listen. I still don't love it, but it easily has the best instrumentation and songwriting of the Bob Dylan albums I've heard. I thought it was generally more dynamic, and I don't know if it was my mood that day or something else, but I found Bob Dylan's songwriting to be a lot more interesting. My favorite tracks were Simple Twist of Fate, You're a Big Girl Now, and If You See Her, Say Hello. This one will probably be a disappointment for the real online music nerds out there, but at 67, I have Fishman's Long Season. I love dream pop, I love neo psychedelia, but I do find something missing from this album for me. To get it out of the way before we talk about the other Fishman's album on this list, I struggle with the lead singer's voice. It honestly takes me out of how beautiful and dreamy the instrumentation is, which is a shame because I think there's beauty all over this 35-minute long single-track album. I think the final section of this album is specifically gorgeous and worth the journey just for that, but this isn't even the best version of this song we'll see on this list, and I'll leave it there for now. At 66, I have Unknown Pleasures by Joy Division, which is the true OG of doomer music, but at least this one has grooves on it. I was a little let down on my re-listen for this album because I had really fond memories of this album, but on a re-listen, outside of a few tracks, I found the whole thing to be a little monotonous. I don't know if that's even an issue for most people with an album that's under 40 minutes, but every track on this album is kind of the same vibe and the same palette, which gets a little tedious by the end, even if that singular vibe is great. I almost enjoy Closer's Ambition more than this album, but at the end of the day, this is, for me, a more enjoyable listen with some real highlights on it. My favorite tracks were Disorder, New Dawn Fades, and Shadowplay. Another horrible take from me, at 65, I have Nas's Illmatic. This is another case of an album that I can't greatly fault in any way, but I'd be lying to myself and I'd be lying to you if I put it any higher. Many of the albums on this list are some of the most influential of all time, and while Illmatic's importance can't be understated, there are just other albums on this list I prefer more. I wouldn't fault anyone for saying this is one of the best rap albums or one of the best albums of all time, but as much as I appreciate it and love certain tracks on it, I just don't love it as a whole. My favorite tracks were New York State of Mind, Life's a Bitch, and One Love. Doolittle by Pixies is an album that I mostly disregarded on my first listen a few years ago, and maybe that's why I found myself pleasantly surprised by it. I'm still not head over heels for it, but what I remembered as a mostly boring indie rock album was a much noisier and interesting experience. It's an album full of these short little tracks that come together and complement each other really well. Still not rushing to put this on all the time, but I did gain a lot of appreciation on this listen. My favorite tracks were Wave of Mutation, I Bleed, and Mr. Greaves. At 63, I Fishmans again with their live album 98-12-28 Otokotachi no Wakare, which is the highest rated live album on Rate Your Music. While my comment from Long Season stands true about not loving the vocals, which did get pretty grating over the 2-hour runtime, this album boasts some of the prettiest and most beautiful soundscapes I've ever heard. The runtime managed to actually help this album by making it easier to really just get lost in the beauty of it. As I implied earlier, the version of Long Season that ends up at the end of this album is phenomenal and even more impressive than the studio version. I really go back and forth on this album because it is a commitment to get through and the vocals can really bother me, but I do really appreciate it as a whole and I can see myself becoming more fond of it in the future. My favorite tracks are on screen right now. Similar to Doolittle, I was pretty underwhelmed when I first listened to Is This It by The Strokes. I still wouldn't say I'm head over heels for it, but I did come to really appreciate how tight and clean this album is. Being a big fan of Interpol's Turn on the Bright Lights, I'm surprised this album isn't as major for me. I do know the connection a lot of people have with this album is very personal, and especially those who were there when this album came out, and I just don't really have that connection with it. That being said, it's still a really good album and a very nice and easy listen. My favorite tracks were Is This It, The Modern Age, and Hard to Explain. From this point on, I think all of these albums are great. I feel the need to say that because at 61, I have Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here. I don't have much I can say to defend this pick given it's a number 4 on the original list, but I've never really connected with this album the way I have with other Pink Floyd albums. To get it out of the way, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, specifically the first 5 parts of it, is my favorite thing Pink Floyd has ever made. That being said, I could kind of take or leave the middle section of this album, which has some cool moments, and the title track is obviously a classic, but it does kind of take me out of the experience of the album and kind of deters me from wanting to listen to the whole thing. That's me having to nitpick Wish You Were Here, but just know that I do love this album, it's just not one that I always return to. My favorite track is obviously Shine On You Crazy Diamond. I can't believe I had never listened to Nirvana's In Utero before making this video. While I don't have the base take of liking this more than Nirvana's most popular album that we'll get to later on this list, I did find myself actually enjoying this quite a lot. It's notably rawer and more intense than Nirvana's most popular album, which I won't name just yet, but I was surprised at how catchy it all still was. There are great hooks all over this, and it's a good angsty experience that I'm excited to become more familiar with over time. My favorite tracks were Scentless Apprentice, Heart-Shaped Box, and Very Ape. At 59, I have Songs of Leonard Cohen by Leonard Cohen. After being kinda let down by other 60s folk albums by Bob Dylan and Nick Drake, I was kinda surprised at how much I enjoyed this album. It's still stripped back, but that restrained nature makes the moments where you get strings or backup vocals that much more impactful. I just found this to be a really mellow and comforting album that I had a great time listening to. I think the middle section is ever so slightly less interesting than the beginning and end, but still this is a great experience all the way through. My favorite tracks were Suzanne, Master Song, and Hey That's No Way to Say Goodbye. At 58, I have 9 Inch Nails' The Downward Spiral. Easily one of the most crushing and intense albums on the whole list. It's one that I admittedly don't go back to that often, but every time I do, I'm kind of in awe of it. I love the heavy and industrial sound of it, but what's so impressive to me is that it remains dynamic throughout the album, which for me means that the noise of it all never really gets dull. It's also genuinely pretty fun to listen to despite how heavy the sound and lyrical matter are, mainly due to some really fun and inventive production. My favorite tracks were Mr. Self-Destruct, March of the Pigs, and Hurt. Next up, I have the Beatles' White Album. There are some days I would consider this to be my favorite Beatles album, and while I don't feel that way today, I still think this is an incredibly eclectic and impressive record. Without a doubt, there are weak points over the 90-minute runtime, but I really love the experimentation throughout the record, and the weirder moments, while great on their own, really help the more standard moments shine. I just find this to be one of the most exciting Beatles albums to listen to because of the variety and clear mastery on display. My favorite tracks were Back in the USSR, Martha My Dear, and I Will. At 56, I have the dream pop classic Souvlaki by Slowdive. It's hard to talk about dream pop or shoegaze without mentioning this album at some point, and I think it's a great album with some really phenomenal layered production on it. I will say that it can get a bit too dreamy for me and a bit lost in that vibe, but that's me having to nitpick the album. Otherwise, I just think this is an excellent album, one of a kind, and one that's been very influential to all dream pop that's come after it. My favorite tracks were Allison, Sing, and Souvlaki Space Station. The first time I ever heard Are You Experienced by Jimi Hendrix, I was trip-sitting my two friends who were doing acid in their dorm room. One of them suggested playing a song off this album, and I can't remember which one it was, but I think it was a fitting introduction to this album. I should note that there are multiple versions of this album due to the UK and US releases, which makes sense because when I was listening to this, I was thinking, man, this is great, I just wish it was a little shorter. Turns out the version on Spotify contains all of the tracks across the multiple versions, which makes it much longer than any of the individual versions themselves. While I do think the compiled version runs a bit long, I'm really glad I got to hear all of the tracks because there are some really great songs on this album. Compared to how sprawling and jammy Electric Ladyland is, this album is filled with much snappier and shorter tracks that ended up working a lot better for me. I loved how rich and psychedelic the sound of this album is, and I found the songwriting to be a lot more interesting this time around, and I loved the multiple experiments throughout the record. My favorite tracks were Purple Haze, May This Be Love, and Are You Experienced. The single worst take I think I've ever given on this channel is when I put the title track of television's Marquee Moon at 89 in my original Rate Your Music singles video. I did my best to rectify that in my re-ranking, but that opinion still haunts me, especially as someone who hadn't heard the whole album when I made that video. What I ended up realizing when I finally listened to the album is not only is that track phenomenal, the whole album is pretty great as well. I love the performances all across this album. It's this great mix of technicality and a sense of youthfulness, and it just really sounds like they had a lot of fun while making it. The whole thing is great, and it doesn't overstay its welcome, which I greatly appreciate. My favorite songs were See No Evil, Marquee Moon, and especially Torn Curtain. At 53, I have Pharoah Sanders' Karma. I'd heard of Pharoah Sanders before, but I never heard of this album before, so I didn't have many expectations going into it, and I ended up really enjoying it. Without a doubt, this is truly one of the most beautiful and spiritual jazz albums I've ever heard. It feels like a heavenly experience over the relatively short runtime, even with the strange spoken word and yodeling thrown in. On release, Ants From Up There by Black Country New Road became one of my favorite albums of all time. The hype around this album before and during its release was something you really just had to be there to see. With time, though, I have soured on this album a little bit, even getting to a point like last year where I kind of didn't even like the album at all. Coming back to it now, I think I've landed somewhere in between, but definitely leaning towards loving it. The performances and true angst on this album is pretty unmatched in modern rock music, and I think it's a really innovative album with the way it blends progressive and experimental rock with chamber pop and classical music. The group gels so well and are able to pull off these tracks that build and swell gorgeously. It's hard to know where to place this album because I've had such a journey with it over the last 3 years, but for right now, this feels like the right place to put it. My favorite tracks were Concord, Good Will Hunting, and The Place Where You Inserted the Blade. Just missing the top 50, I have Massive Attack's Mezzanine. I think Mezzanine is a really interesting addition to the trip-hop landscape as its influence from industrial rock makes it darker than really anything from the genre at this time. When I first heard this album, I immediately compared it to another very famous trip-hop album that we'll get to later, and because I love that album so much, I think I wasn't able to fully appreciate this one. Now, being able to look back at that, I do think Mezzanine is a really fantastic album. The only thing holding it back for me are the vocal performances when there's not a guest featured. I love the inclusion of Elizabeth Fraser of Cocteau Twins on a few of these tracks, but I think the deadpan, almost spoken word delivery kinda kills the momentum on some of these songs. Still, I think this is a really great album that I've really come around to over time. My favorite songs were Rising Sun, Teardrop, and Dissolved Girl. Finally hitting the top half of this list, at number 50, I have Loveless by My Bloody Valentine. For those who have watched my videos ranking the Rate Your Music singles, you might know that I've previously criticized My Bloody Valentine for being too noisy and too loose for my taste. While my re-ranking had higher spots for the singles off of this album, what really changed my opinion on it was rewatching Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation, which has an excellent needle drop of the song Sometimes. After that, I became obsessed with that song, and it really rose up to become one of my favorites of all time. I just found it to be a really interesting ballad that used the noisy guitars and deadpan delivery to create a really chilling and haunting atmosphere, and it made me reevaluate the whole album. I still find that this album really rests on its highlights, and there are tracks from it that don't really go anywhere, but I think over time I'll come to appreciate this album even more than I do now. My favorite songs on it were When You Sleep, Sometimes, and Blown a Wish. At 49, I will hopefully gain some sympathy from the Godspeed You fans that I pissed off earlier, because here I have Lift Your Skinny Fists Like Antennas to Heaven by Godspeed You Black Emperor. I'm not always a big fan of the super atmospheric style of post-rock, but for whatever reason, this album has really always stuck with me. I absolutely adore the bleak and apocalyptic atmosphere of this record, which I think the group pulls off a lot better than they did on F Sharp A Sharp. There are better and more standout uses of the field recordings, and there are some absolutely stunning build-ups and payoffs throughout this album. I think the whole thing runs a little long toward the end, but I still think this is a fantastic album, and we're still somehow only at 49 on this list. My favorite track was Sleep. At 48, I have to give it to the late Jeff Buckley with his album Grace. I'm not the first person to say this, and I will not be the last, but Jeff Buckley had one of the most standout voices in all of rock and singer-songwriter music. His voice just soars over this album, and he controls it so well through the tense builds and emotional explosions. This album is just such a great showcase of that, along with having some really phenomenal songs. It's such a shame that this is the only true album Jeff Buckley got to make, but at least we have it. My favorite songs were Grace, So Real, and Lover You Should Have Come Over. Finally getting to the last of the 4 albums on this list by this band, at 47 I have Revolver by the Beatles. I just think as a whole, this is the most enjoyable showcase of what makes the Beatles so great. The songs are just snappier, the arrangements are more elegant, and the album as a whole does not overstay its welcome. It has almost as many highlights as the White Album, but it does so with a much trimmer track list that only has a few duds on it. It still manages to experiment and get weird, like with the South Asian influence on Love You Too, or Eleanor Rigby, which was so inventive for the time and blew my mind when I heard it as a kid. It's such a fun and dynamic time that makes for my favorite Beatles album. My favorite songs were Eleanor Rigby, Here, There, and Everywhere, and For No One. There was a time where I considered Late Registration to be my favorite Kanye album. I don't necessarily agree anymore, but through this re-listen, I can definitely see why I thought that. I think Late Registration has a great balance of the chipmunk soul and underdog energy of the album that preceded it, and also the pop sensibilities of Graduation, along with some really stunning arrangements with help from John Bryan. There are just so many fantastic tracks on this album that are fun and snappy, with irresistible hooks and super fun production. I do think some tracks bring the whole album down, and as a whole, as I've said a million times in this video, I wish it was a few tracks shorter to just make that track list tighter. Still, the product here is great, and it's a good reminder of when Kanye was actually likable. My favorite tracks were Drive Slow, Roses, and Diamonds from Sierra Leone. Every time I listen to Nevermind by Nirvana, I'm just taken aback by how fucking good it is. It's not that I ever really doubt it going in, I'm just not the biggest fan of grunge music, yet this album manages to appeal to just about everybody without really sacrificing too much. I mentioned how catchy In Utero was, but Nevermind is even better in that department with some of the best hooks that 90s rock music had to offer. There's just so much palpable angst on this album, and it ends up being a really enjoyable listen. My favorite songs were In Bloom, Come As You Are, and Breed. I wasn't crazy about Low by David Bowie when I first listened to it, and in retrospect I can see why. It's obviously different from all of his other albums, excluding the Berlin trilogy, with its focus on ambient music and much looser structures. On a re-listen, I've come to really appreciate the gorgeous soundscape on this album and how well the ambient second half complements that first half. David Bowie is great on this album, but there are other albums we'll get to that really showcase his talent, because I think Brian Eno is really the star of this album. His production really is the best part of this album, and it leaves this as a really unique and fantastic rock album. My favorite songs were Speed of Life, Sound of Vision, and Subterraneans. Putting The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd over Wish You Were Here might be the lamest take I have in this entire video. My only real defense is that the issues I outlined with Wish You Were Here are not here. Dark Side of the Moon has a shockingly tight track list for how expansive and legendary it is. There isn't really a wasted track outside of maybe On the Run, which I still think adds to the sci-fi space atmosphere of the whole thing. I do have nostalgia with this album that I can't really erase, but there are beautiful and engaging moments all throughout this album. Really every track gets its own moment to shine, leading to a really stunning finale. My favorite tracks were Time, The Great Gig in the Sky, and Any Color You Like. Laughingstock by Talk Talk was an album that I did not anticipate making it this high, especially because I wasn't that hot on it on my first listen. I think I got lucky because I was unknowingly in the perfect mood for this album on my re-listen. I've used the word apocalyptic in this video a few times before, but Laughingstock is a different type of apocalyptic. The sounds are not dark, instead it's a light and airy album with a persistent sense of melancholy that permeates every track here. I was just able to really sink into this album and ended up loving it. My favorite tracks were Ascension Day, After the Flood, and Newgrass. At 41, I have DJ Shadow's Introducing, which stands as one of the most important instrumental hip-hop albums ever made. It's another album that's really easy to get lost in through the hypnotic drum patterns and fantastic use of sampling throughout. Similar to another instrumental album we'll get to soon, this is a great album to take a walk to or do homework to, but it can also be enjoyed as a full listen. I listen to it quite a lot, and I enjoy it every single time. My favorite songs were Building Steam with a Grain of Salt, Stem/Long Stem, and Midnight in a Perfect World. At 40, I have the former top one, which is OK Computer by Radiohead. Similar to The Dark Side of the Moon, I think people have really soured on this album because of its popularity. While it's the lowest of the three Radiohead albums here, I still think it's fantastic and one of the most influential albums of all time. There's so many great songs on this album that are fun and interesting to listen to, and there are real feelings of sadness and frustration with the world that still come through 30 years later. I also think personally this is a real step up from The Bends and was the first Radiohead album that really defined who they were before they completely broke that on the album that followed. My favorite tracks were Paranoid Android, Exit Music for a Film, and Karma Police. At 39, I have Kanye West's debut album, The College Dropout. This ended up getting the slight edge over Late Registration just because I think it's a bit more exciting, and I think Kanye is a much more interesting central figure on this album. His rapping throughout the album is consistently funny and witty, but the real stunning aspect of this album is the sampling. Pretty much every track has excellent uses of sampling of old school soul music, which gives this album a unique touch because Kanye never made another album that embraced chipmunk soul this much again. I'll say that the 12-minute closer feels a bit unnecessary, but otherwise this is a pretty spotless album that still feels fresh today. My favorite tracks were Spaceship, Slow Jams, and Family Business. Animals by Pink Floyd is my favorite Pink Floyd album. Instead of having two long tracks that sandwich three shorter tracks, this album has two shorter tracks that sandwich three longer tracks. And in this case, I think it works a lot better because all of it is about this Orwellian critique of capitalism. On a re-listen, I really confirmed that the three main tracks on this album are some of Pink Floyd's greatest accomplishments. I absolutely love the progression of these tracks, along with how experimental they all are, incorporating electronic elements perfectly, making these unique, strange rock songs. My favorite song was Dogs. At 37, I have Selected Ambient Works 85 through 92 by Aphex Twin. It's hard to talk about this album because I think what's so good about it is right there on the surface. It's hypnotic, entrancing electronic music that's similar to Introducing, is great as background music, but is also something you can actively listen to. I just love how spacey and airy all of the sounds are, and the best tracks in this album can really lock you into a groove that you get lost in for the duration of the whole track. I don't have too much more to say than that, it's just one of the best electronic albums of all time. My favorite tracks were Crystal, Aegisopolis, and Helios Fan. When I started making this video, there was only one album on the list that I'd literally never heard of, and that was Club da Esquina by Milton Nascimento and Lil Borges. I don't know anything about the context of this album, other than it's from Brazil, but I thought it was excellent. It's a really perfect album for the summers, it's just so lovely to listen to. It's really one of the most soothing and mellow albums I've ever listened to, and as of late, I've really needed that. It's also not just a calming album, it's full of unique influences and genre fusions that mix bossa nova with psychedelic rock and folk music that make it a really engaging listen. I can definitely see this rising up the ranks in the future, but I'll leave it here for now. My favorite tracks were Nuvem Cigana, Girassol da Cor do Su Cabello, and Trem de Doido. I'm sorry. If you're subscribed to me, it's most likely because of the Death Grips ranking I did 4 years ago. I'm not as avid of a Death Grips listener as I once was, but The Money Store by Death Grips remains one of the best and most inventive rap albums of the 2010s. I hadn't sat through this whole album in a while, and I was just so surprised at how fun of a listen this still is 13 years after its release. The beats are still pretty much unmatched, with the combinations of industrial music and shades of techno and dance music remaining super unique to this project. I also found myself resonating more with the deep cuts this time around, as even the songs that don't have the strongest hooks or aren't the catchiest has something that you can take away from. The album also has one of the best and most cathartic album closers I've ever heard. My favorite tracks were Lost Boys, Punkweight, and obviously Hacker. When I first listened through Outkast's discography, Aquemini did not stand out as a favorite for whatever reason. I found myself connecting more with AT Aliens and Stankonia, and I was surprised to find out later that this is their most acclaimed album by fans. On a re-listen though, it made complete sense, and I can't believe there was a time where I didn't connect with Aquemini. This album hosts some of the most luxurious production of any rap album ever, and that really shows in the lengthy tracks toward the end of the album that really rest on how beautiful these instrumentals are. Obviously, Andre and Big Boi are in top form here, although I don't know if there's another Outkast album besides their debut where they're not in top form. The rapping continues to sound so unique and has retroactively made me want more out of other 90s rap albums. Nobody has flows like these two, and this remains such a great listen from front to back. My favorite tracks were The Return of the G, Aquemini, and The Artist Storytelling Part 1. I can't believe I had never listened to Inner Visions by Stevie Wonder before making this video. I think Stevie's most acclaimed album that we'll get to later is so dense that I didn't feel a need to explore the rest of his discography, which in retrospect is stupid because Inner Visions is phenomenal. I love how tight this album is, along with how many different sounds Stevie explores through this album. It's surprisingly eclectic for the time and for the relatively short length, but everything Stevie does is so great to listen to. I'm really excited to soak up this album and really delve into it, and I'm really glad this video pushed me to finally listen to it. My favorite tracks were Visions, Golden Lady, and Don't You Worry About a Thing. At 32, I have Either Or by Elliott Smith. When I was 17 or so, I had a big Elliott Smith phase, which probably contributed to how depressed I was at the time. And Either Or is just a shining example of how beautiful and subtle Elliott's songwriting could be. This is an interesting album in his catalog because it's between an album that's more stripped back and sadder and an album that's far more lavish and has greater arrangements on it. I love both of those albums, but Either Or is a great showcase of what made Elliott Smith so great. I think the songs on here really managed to stick with you, not because they're catchy, but there's an intangible aspect to it that really makes it stick with you, or at least has made it stick with me. So many fantastic songs, and it just feels natural in a way that not a lot of albums are. My favorite songs were Alameda, Pictures of Me, and Say Yes. Disintegration by The Cure is an album I have a surprising amount of nostalgia for. I think Disintegration is a phenomenal showcase of what post-punk had evolved to at the time, but it's so dreamy and atmospheric that it barely feels like a punk record. I love how cinematic it is and how huge parts of it are. It's just one you have to listen to really appreciate. My favorite tracks were Love Song, Fascination Street, and Disintegration. You know, I said the worst take I've given on this channel was about Marquee Moon by Television? I lied. The worst take I've given on this channel is anything I've said about Talking Heads and anything off of Remain in Light. There's a specific thing we'll get to later on this list that made me really get Talking Heads, but on its own, this is a really fun, fascinating, and inventive listen. Nobody was doing it like Talking Heads, and I'm sincerely sorry for how much shit I've talked about them in the past. There's not much I can add about this album other than I was surprised at how dynamic it was. I remembered it being so frenetic and crazy, but the second half really balances it out, and I really appreciated the whole thing this time around. My favorite songs were Born Under Punches, The Great Curve, and Listening Wind. The first time I listened to Danny Brown's Atrocity Exhibition, I was in 7th grade on the bus to school. I listened to half of the opening track, Downward Spiral, and immediately turned it off because it was too scary for me. A year or two later, I heard Ain't It Funny on its own, and I couldn't believe a song sounded like that, so I gave the album another chance and ended up absolutely loving it. I don't know if there's a better anti-drug PSA than this album, but it ends up still being so much fun to listen to. Danny really proves himself to be one of the best rappers alive on this album, rapping over some of the strangest beats ever put onto a rap album, and making it seem effortless along the way. I think this album is already a classic, and I'm really glad to see that it's this high on the Rate Your Music list. My favorite tracks were Ain't It Funny, Pneumonia, and When It Rain. Donuts by J Dilla will forever be remembered as probably the greatest instrumental hip-hop album of all time. There is nobody in hip-hop who did sampling like J Dilla, as he manages to convey so much emotion through these samples and through the beats. I also think this is a really fun album to listen to, one that's continuously stimulating because Dilla doesn't stay on any single sound for too long. He really jumps all over the place, which makes this album dizzying in one sense, but really heartfelt and emotional in another way, especially given the context of the album. My favorite tracks were Stop, Lightworks, and Don't Cry. For all of the jazz heads who are somehow still watching, at 27, I have Charles Mingus's The Black Saint and The Sinner Lady. It's really hard for me to talk about jazz music, as it's a genre I'm still relatively unfamiliar with, but this album gives me a feeling that's really hard to describe. It's just easy to get lost in between the excellent solos and gorgeous motifs that pop up throughout the record. It's my go-to jazz album at this point, and will probably stay that way for a while. My favorite track was track C, Group Dancers. When it comes to feel-good albums, there are very few albums that hit quite as hard as Since I Left You by the Avalanches, especially considering it's pretty much entirely made up of samples. There's a summery and beachy quality to the album that does not get stale over the course of it. And it all flows together seamlessly as if it's the best DJ set you've ever heard performed on a beach somewhere. I love the dynamics of this album, how it's really high energy and chaotic at some points, and then really low energy and calming at other points, but it never feels jarring as we go from one moment to another. I think this album is phenomenal and will never fail to put me in a good mood. My favorite tracks were Since I Left You, 2 Hearts in 3/4 Time, and Frontier Psychiatrist. There was a time where I thought Kid A by Radiohead was slightly overrated, and I greatly preferred OK Computer. I still don't think that's an awful take, but over the years I've really gained an appreciation for every track on this album and how exciting it all is. Kid A is often referred to as Radiohead's first electronic album and first major left turn in their discography, but tracks like the national anthem, How to Disappear Completely, and Optimistic don't sound like a band making a left turn for the sake of it, they sound like maturity. Really, I think this is the perfect example of what a band should do when they make an album that they can't match. They should experiment, get weird, and mature. Obviously that's not always possible, but on Kid A, the tracks hit harder and the emotions manage to resonate even deeper. The aforementioned national anthem is not unlike Radiohead's material before it, but the chaotic horn section that ends the track was not even in the group's wheelhouse before this album came out. I just think it's a beautifully mature and excellent album that I've really come to appreciate as I've gotten older. My favorite tracks were Everything in Its Right Place, How to Disappear Completely, and Motion Picture Soundtrack. There is not much I can say about Kate Bush's Hounds of Love that has not already been said before. Very few pop albums are able to balance such infectious and catchy songwriting with insane experimentation the way the Hounds of Love does. The first half of this album dishes out track after track of some of the most lavish and gorgeous pop music ever made without ever missing a beat. The hits are hits for a reason, and they're still my favorite tracks on the album, but the deep cuts are phenomenal as well. What really defines this album is its experimental second half, which is a concept about a woman drowning, and it's really unbelievable stuff. It's hard not to feel a little lost while listening to it, but it's crazy to me that an album this popular goes down such an insane path that the tracks are still so fun and produced so immaculately. My favorite tracks were Running Up That Hill, Cloud Busting, and Waking Up the Witch. At 23, I have Food by MF Doom. There's not much of a story I have around this album other than it's fantastic and surprises me every time I listen to it just how well put together it is. Obviously I love the whole novel food concept that runs through it, but as a rap album it's so fun and entertaining to listen to and easily my favorite solo Doom project. I think on this re-listen I was surprised at just how many great tracks there are on this album. There isn't really a weak spot aside from the 4-part Plunderphonics middle section of the album, which is fun, I just don't love it personally. Otherwise, I really think this album is spotless, and Doom performs excellently on it. His flows and lyricism are as good as ever, and the beats are instantaneous and perfect. My favorite tracks were Hoe Cakes, Potholders and Rap Snitch Knishes. At number 22, I have the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. As we get higher and higher on this list, it's hard to point out exactly what's so exceptional about these albums. They're just fantastic to listen to. Pet Sounds is an unbelievable listen from front to back and really one of the most joyously put together albums out there. The vocal melodies and breezy production are unmatched 60 years after it came out, even on some of the smaller moments like the instrumental interlude Let's Go Away for a While. All I wish is that this album had a better album cover just to fit how great it actually is. My favorite songs were Wouldn't It Be Nice, Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder, and God Only Knows. For all of my East Coast hip-hop fans that I've definitely pissed off at this point, at 21, I have Wu-Tang's Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers. Maybe it is just a collaboration effort here, but this album is still so exciting to listen to in a modern day context. I think the only major issue I have with it are that the skits are a bit long and outdated, but even that doesn't take away from the energy in all of these tracks. Every performer sounds hungry and excited, and it leads to this being a really infectious and fun listen. The group also provides more serious moments, and those songs are the ones that have stuck with me most through the years. The production, courtesy of the RZA, is consistently murky, interesting, and sometimes jazzy, but always is there to complement the rappers on top of it. My favorite tracks were Clan in the Front, Can It All Be So Simple, and Tears. Entering the top 20, I have David Bowie's classic, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. Really one of the most cinematic and lavish rock albums, not only of the era, but of all time. The album manages to feel so grand while fitting in such a tight track list, which, if you couldn't tell by the amount of times I've mentioned it so far, is something I really appreciate. There's not much in the way of faults on this album. It's one that I think you could pretty much show anyone, and there's a very high likelihood that they'd enjoy it. My favorite tracks were 5 Years, Starman, and Ain't It Easy. Earlier when I talked about Remain in Light, I mentioned that there was something that made me change my mind on Talking Heads, and that thing is Stop Making Sense. I decided for this video I'd watch the film as it's super acclaimed both as an album and as a film, and I am so glad that I did. I can't describe the pure joy I felt as you get to see the band members and all of the additional people on tour with them give these songs a new sense of life that is just remarkable. I will admit that this is the only album on this list that I watched a movie for, which definitely gives it a leg up, but I can't imagine experiencing it any other way. In my original Rate Your Music Singles video, I put This Must Be the Place in the last spot, and in my remake, I put it in the second last spot, only above Once in a Lifetime. In retrospect, I cannot believe I did that, because seeing David Byrne perform this song with the lamp was so beautiful and sincere that it made me fall in love with the song. I think this is a flawless performance, and if you have not seen the film, I cannot recommend it enough. My favorite tracks were Slippery People, This Must Be the Place, and Girlfriend is Better. Going into this video, I kinda dreaded listening to Sufjan Stevens' Carrie and Lowell, and if you've heard it, you probably know why. This is one of the most brutally sad albums out there, real misery in audio form, but on re-listen, I was just surprised at how pretty it all was. I hadn't heard this album in years because it was so emotionally devastating on a first listen, but this album is not just great because it captures grief and self-hatred in ways that no other album has. It is also gorgeously arranged and so pleasant on the ears that the bitter and tough lyrics go down a lot easier. I really found a new sense of appreciation for this album, and since re-listening, I've been going back to multiple tracks not only for the emotional honesty, but for the gorgeous sound of it all. My favorite tracks were Death with Dignity, Should Have Known Better, and The Only Thing. At 17, I have Daft Punk's Discovery. Completely contrasting the last album, Discovery is like pure joy in audio form. Some of the most euphoric and easy to listen to electronic music ever made. I'm so happy that this album is as well regarded as it is because it really is just that delightful. For an album that's mostly instrumental outside of a few tracks, it really does a lot to keep the listener engaged, even if it's definitely meant for more of a live setting. Even when listening with headphones or in my car, I always have a great time listening to this album. My favorite tracks were Aerodynamic, Digital Love, and Veritas Quo. In terms of art pop, very few albums come close to Björk's Homogenic. I will spoil it now that this is not the only Björk album on this list, but I really want to focus here on just how beautiful and revolutionary Homogenic is. Following the very eclectic post, Björk said that she wanted to make an album that was just beats and strings, and that's exactly what she did here. With that, it's one of her most cohesive albums, but it still feels like a sampling platter of everything that makes her so great. You have lavish, gigantic songs with huge emotions like Yoga and Bachelorette, But then there's the menacing opener, Hunter, and then there's the more subtle Unravel, that's absolutely beautiful. And then there's the absolutely explosive Pluto, which is one of her most abrasive tracks to date. I just love everything about this album, and it pains me that I can't put it higher on this list. My favorite tracks were Unravel, Bachelorette, and Pluto. At 15, I have Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid, Mad City. After my emo phase in elementary school and early middle school, there are a few albums that I can credit getting me into broader music, and Good Kid, Mad City is one of them. I remember my sister showing me songs off this album and me being really blown away. Especially as a child who loves movies and someone who still does now, there's something so cinematic about these songs that I really latched onto. That, along with the catchy hooks and poppier songs interstitched with these longer and more expansive tracks, made this a really easy album to access and one that I'm still impressed with now. I'm still shocked at how good of a storyteller Kendrick is, and this album managed to do all of that while still being a really engaging listen throughout. My favorite songs were Money Trees, Mad City, and Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst. The first time I listened to What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, I believe I was a sophomore in high school in study hall, and I decided to just throw it on. I really enjoyed it, but I'm pretty sure I never went back to this album again, which is embarrassing to admit, but here we are, and this album is unbelievable. I did not remember it all flowing together, which is such a great touch and leads this to being so cohesive as an album. The songs are pretty loose, but it all works together as this gorgeous album that is pretty whimsical, honestly. It almost sounds wrong to say that because of the conscious lyrics, but with all the arrangements and strings, it's pretty otherworldly. It's such a phenomenal listen. I feel like anyone can enjoy this album, and I'm really glad this video got me to finally re-listen to it. My favorite tracks were What's Going On, Flying High in the Friendly Sky, and Mercy Mercy Me, The Ecology. Sufjan Stevens is actually one of 6 artists to have 2 albums that are in my personal top 25, but no other artist has 2 albums that sound as different as Carrie and Lowell and Illinois. Contrasting the sad indie folk of Carrie and Lowell, Illinois is straight up jubilant chamber pop, which makes for one of the grandest indie albums ever. It is such an enchanting album through all the interludes and different bits of subject matter that all come back to the state of Illinois. I think the vocal arrangements on this album are unbelievable, and the album flows so well together and so grand it really earns its runtime. I don't have much more to say about it, it's just an excellent album and my personal favorite of Sufjan's albums. My favorite tracks were Come On Feel the Illinois, John Wayne Gacy Jr., and Chicago. In some ways, I don't think In the Aeroplane Over the Sea is that different from the album I have at number 12, which is The Glow Part 2 by The Microphones. They came out within 3 years of each other, and they're both experimental takes on indie folk and indie rock with lo-fi production, but they're 83 spots away from each other on this list because I actually feel something when I listen to The Glow Part 2. Starting with one of the craziest runs of tracks in the first leg of the album, the record doesn't necessarily lose steam after that as much as it goes fully off the rails into passages of drone music, acoustic interludes, and even a steel drum break on the Gleam Part 2, but it all makes sense as in this haunting, one-of-a-kind record. It's not an album I can revisit all the time because it is devastating or requires your full attention, but there's not another album that's exactly like this one. My favorite tracks are The Moon, Map, and I Felt Your Shape. Just missing out on the top 10, I have Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life. I've said a few times in this video that certain albums can be enjoyed by anybody, but Songs in the Key of Life should be enjoyed by everybody. You could maybe fault this album for being nearly 2 hours, but it's so phenomenally put together with so many excellent tracks that it really does earn that runtime. The production on this album still sounds stellar 50 years later. It is incredible to me how great every vocal part and instrument sounds and how they all work together. Every track has something to enjoy, and it's really just an inspiring and beautiful listen from front to back. My favorite tracks were Love's in Need of Love Today, Knocks Me Off My Feet, and As. Now entering the top 10, at number 10, I have to give it to David Bowie's Black Star. It's hard to separate this album from its context, as David Bowie's knowledge of his impending death permeates all of the lyrics on this album. It's a heartbreaking and sometimes terrifying album, but Bowie faces it all head on, with some of his most experimental production to date culminating in what I think is his magnum opus. No other Bowie album hits me like this, and each of the 7 tracks are phenomenal in their own right. Bowie plays with elements of electronic and jazz music that come together into a consistently stimulating set of songs that you cannot listen to passively. They yearn for your attention. I think it is a perfect send-off to one of the greatest artists to ever live, and I'm so glad that he was able to finish this album before passing, as it is a true masterpiece. My favorite songs were Black Star, Lazarus, and Dollar Days. At number 9, I have Björk once again with Vespertine. With all of the praise I gave Homogenic, which I still think is a tighter set of songs, Vespertine comes out on top with one of the most interesting atmospheres to any album I've ever heard. Vespertine's production is still comprised of beats and strings, but this time the beats are jittery and they sound unlike anything that Björk has ever worked with before this point. It lends this album to having a wintry atmosphere that contrasts the lovesick and horny lyrics all over this album. The album is impossibly beautiful, and Björk matches that perfectly with some of her most purposeful vocal performances to date. She knows exactly when to belt and when to whisper, which makes for a really powerful listen. The first half is most of the standout tracks, but the second half is an exercise in building this atmosphere, culminating in a phenomenal final track that ends this album on a warmer note. My favorite songs were Hidden Place, It's Not Up to You, and Pagan Poetry. At number 8, I have the current highest rated album on the Rate Your Music list, and that is To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar. Trying to find anything original to say about this album is difficult, but if Good Kid, Mad City got me into music, this album pushed the boundaries of what I thought music could be. It's similarly cinematic, but the influences of jazz and funk give this a whole new feeling, filled with so many emotional highs and devastating lows that it feels like Kendrick's almost doing a one-person play. Kendrick goes above and beyond vocally to sell these tracks, and it's all over some of the most lush instrumentation on any rap album out there. Kendrick's storytelling on Good Kid is fantastic, but while on those tracks it feels like he is narrating a story, in this album it feels like he's directly in it. Especially in moments like You and How Much a Dollar Costs, which are some of the most cinematic and emotionally resonant moments on the record. It's a perfect album, maybe aside from the weird MJ bar on Mortal Man, but I think this album cemented Kendrick as one of the greatest rappers ever. My favorite songs were Wesley's Theory, Institutionalized, and All Right. At number 7, it's Heaven or Las Vegas by Cocteau Twins. Talk about an album that has no weak spots. For as ethereal and dreamy as this album is, each track has its own personality, which is super rare for a dream pop album. Elizabeth Fraser's voice flies over these gorgeous soundscapes, and even though her lyrics are entirely unintelligible, I don't care because it's so beautiful. Every time I listen to this album, it just hits me how perfect it all is, and I've had my moment with every track here, culminating to me really appreciating the entire album. There's not really a weak point on it, and it's probably my favorite true dream pop album of all time. My favorite songs were Pitch the Baby, Heaven or Las Vegas, and Frou Frou Foxes in Midsummer Fires. I think To Pimp a Butterfly would make sense as the highest rated rap album on this list because of how grand and important it is. But this is entirely my personal opinion, and at number 6, I have MF Doom and Madlib's Mad Villainy. Similar to Food, I have a hard time explaining what's so great about this album, but it has stuck with me greatly over the years. This album's just an aha moment where a producer is in top form and a rapper is in top form, and they come together to make a perfect rap album. Doom's verses are intricate, but they're still so funny, and he flows over every beat perfectly. Madlib's production and samples are phenomenal and gives every song a unique personality that Doom complements super well. I love how fractured it all is too. The songs are very short and are spliced with interludes and instrumental bits, but it all comes together to make a really perfect album. My favorite tracks were Meat Grinder, Figaro, and All Caps. We're now entering the top 5, which I think will really show where my biases are because these are just 5 of my favorite albums ever. At number 5, I have Sweet Trips, Velocity Design, Comfort. I've talked about a few albums that really changed the way I look at music, and my first listen of Velocity Design, Comfort was unbelievable. I think it was my senior year of high school when I first heard it, and it took me to another planet entirely. There are few albums that are as otherworldly as this one through its combination of electronic music, dream pop, and shoegaze. It contrasts beautiful vocal melodies with harsh electronics and noisy guitars, but the moments of relief are unforgettable. I do think the album is a little front-loaded, but I can't put this any lower because I do love every track on here. It's just that the first half contains some of my absolute favorite songs of all time. There is nothing more blissful than the final few minutes of Sept, which might be my favorite song ever made. I think as time goes on, this album will remain singular because nothing else really sounds like it, and it still sounds futuristic 20 years after its release. If you want an album that sounds like the future, this is it. My favorite songs were Disco, Fruitcake and Cookies, and obviously Sept. When I talked about Massive Attack's Mezzanine, I mentioned comparing it to another famous trip-hop album, and if you haven't figured out what that is yet, it's Dummy by Portishead. This album has one of the most unbelievable track lists to me. I think every track is perfect and fits the album in exactly the right place. There isn't a miss in the whole album, and it manages to keep your attention despite the whole thing being very uniform. On every track, you're getting head-nodding beats, haunting vocals, and strange samples that make you feel like you're in a cold, rainy night in England. It's melancholic and the lyrics are mostly about heartbreak, but it's all so entertaining to listen to. How tragic Beth Gibbons' vocals are. I love how the group shows restraint on every track. Very few moments are loud or in your face. It's all quite reserved, even with the emotional climax of Glory Box, which is still restrained and that much cooler because of it. My favorite tracks were Numb, Roads, and Glory Box. One of the biggest things that can attract people to an album are the memories they associate with it, especially if it's soundtracked a big part of their life. For me, that is Igor by Tyler, the Creator. This album came out right at the end of freshman year of high school for me, which was pretty tumultuous, and this ended up soundtracking the summer that followed. What makes it even stronger as a soundtrack is that there isn't much music out there like Igor. Tyler taps into something mutant and strange, mixing pop and R&B melodies with this rough around the edge production, crazy synths, mutant vocal effects, and pounding distorted drums to all create something that's so unique. With all that experimentation, the album still manages to be really fun and accessible. That being said, it is the more strange, ambitious tracks that have really stuck with me over the years. This is the second newest album on the list, and in the 6 years since it's released, I can't believe it's already climbed to 31 on the list, but I think that's incredibly well deserved. My favorite tracks were A Boy Is a Gun, Puppet, and Gone Gone / Thank You. At number 2, I have an album that was my go-to answer for being my favorite album for a long time. Nowadays, I couldn't really tell you what my favorite album is, but In Rainbows by Radiohead is definitely still up there. Radiohead effectively distilled everything that made them a great band up to this point, and spread it across these 10 perfect tracks that vary in sound but all come together beautifully. I love that the electronic influence of Kid A is still here in songs like 15 Step or The Closer Videotape, but what really defines the album for me are the more serene art rock songs that make for some of the most gorgeous moments of Radiohead's career. I'm very excited for the day that this overtakes OK Computer in the charts because I think very few albums have aged as well as In Rainbows has. My favorite tracks were Nude, Weird Fishes / Arpeggi, and Reckoner. Finally, at number 1, I have an album that will probably be anticlimactic for some people considering how many classic and incredible albums we've already gone through. But I had to be honest with myself in picking the number 1 spot, and on a re-listen, my favorite album on this list is Blonde by Frank Ocean. Similar to Igor, I have a lot of memories and nostalgia tied to this album, but beyond that, Blonde features some of the most emotionally powerful songs I've ever heard. There are songs on this album I can barely listen to without crying because of Frank's honest lyrics and stunning vocals paired with instrumentation that was really influential for the R&B world. Songs like Solo and Self-Control are stripped back but give way for Frank's incredible storytelling, which not only grieves a breakup but grieves his former self as he realizes he can't be that same person anymore. Many of these tracks depict memories of who he used to be, but this album emphasizes that he is not that person anymore. Having this album through my adolescence up to my adulthood has been incredibly important to me, and I don't know if there's another album out there that I consider more important to me. Plus, I love all of the risks taken on this album through its unpredictable and lengthy track list. I think all the different interludes and shorter tracks really complement the other ones and really make the more substantial songs hit even harder. There's just nothing out there like Blonde, and that's why I had to put it at the top spot. My favorite tracks were Self-Control, Nights, and Siegfried. Before I wrap up this video, I wanted to go over some albums that I think should be on this list. These are not just some of my favorites, these are albums that are popular enough and culturally relevant enough to realistically be on this list. I won't be including albums from artists that are already on the list, but if you want to see those, they are on screen right now. The most glaring issue with this list is the absence of women on it. There are only 12 albums here that are made by solo women or bands with women in them, and even worse, there are only 3 albums made by solo women, and 2 of them are Björk albums. There are also no albums by black women on here, which is appalling given how much black women have contributed to the modern landscape of music. Before I get into the albums, I do want to emphasize these are just albums that I've heard and loved, so there are probably some big ones that I am not going to be including. If there are any albums that you think should be on the list, comment them down below. So, in no particular order, these are some albums that I think should be on the list. Maybe the most glaring omission on the list is Lauryn Hill's The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. It's an album that's considered to be one of the best of all time, yet it sits at 160 on the list. I think it's an unbeatable blend of rap and R&B with some incredible production and performances. It was a massively successful album too, both commercially and critically, winning Album of the Year at the Grammys, yet it is not on the list. Just as crazy to me is the absence of D'Angelo in the top 100. I think any of his 3 major albums could be argued to be on the list, but personally I think Voodoo would make the most sense, which is also the highest rated on the site. Another R&B artist who handled production all by themselves, D'Angelo, has one of the best and most unique voices of all time and is one of the pioneers of the neo-soul genre. Another pioneer of the neo-soul genre is Erykah Badu, and I think Mama's Gun should have definitely been on the list. It's another fantastic R&B album that's creative, versatile, and brings a lot to the table that a lot of the albums on the list don't, in my opinion. In terms of artists that I'm surprised have no entries on the list, I have to go with who is probably my favorite songwriter of all time, and that's Fiona Apple. I think you could argue 4 of her 5 albums could be on the list, but the one I'm most surprised isn't is When the Pawn. Nobody was really making music like her at the time, and it's another album that I'm just baffled isn't on the list. A take that I hope should be agreeable is the absence of Sade on the list. I think Love Deluxe would make the most sense to be on the list, and it's my personal favorite of hers, but I think you could argue for Diamond Life as well. I've never met someone who doesn't like Sade, and her mix of jazz, soul, and pop music makes for some of the most enjoyable music ever. Public Enemy's It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back is older than any of the hip-hop albums on the list, yet still feels more ahead of its time. It's a risky and bold album that I really think should have been on the list. I also think Things Fall Apart by The Roots is another fantastic rap album that I would have loved to see on the list. It's a conscious album with some beautiful jazzy production in Black Thought and top form. It's just a great listen. I'm surprised there aren't many older soul albums, like pre-60s soul albums, and I think the biggest one missing in that regard is Aretha Franklin's I Never Loved a Man the Way I Loved You. Obviously there are no other singers like Aretha, and I think this is a fantastic showcase of that while also being super enjoyable in a modern context. City pop is one of my favorite genres that I wish was represented here. My pick, and maybe the most popular pick, would be Henri's Timely, which is one of the most bubbly and fun pop albums I've ever heard. Amazing arrangements and beautiful melodies all over this album. It's one that's really hard not to enjoy. In terms of 90s albums, I would have loved to see Stereolab's Dots and Loops. I think it's one of the most creative albums ever made, blending a ton of genres together into a super enjoyable experience that I think anyone could really enjoy. If you've never heard this one, please do yourself a favor and listen to it. Maybe one that some people would disagree with. I think the more time that goes by, the better The Velvet Rope by Janet Jackson ages. It's an album that wasn't received well on Impact, but has aged so well and predicted the future of R&B in some ways. It did all of that while still holding onto the stylings of New Jack Swing and trip hop, which make this a really fun and eclectic album to listen to. I also want to point to a few newer albums that I think could be on the list in the future. Carsey Hedris' Twin Fantasy is an album that's pretty synonymous with Rate Your Music, so I'm surprised it's not on the list. I do think it deserves to be there, as it's one of the most important indie rock albums of the last 10 years, if not of all time. Sophie's Oil of Every Pearl's On Insides has an embarrassingly low score given how predictive it has been for the future of electronic music and how fun and great of a listen it is. Rest in peace, Sophie, of course. LP by JPEG Mafia is my personal favorite album of his and the highest rated album of his. I think it represents his new attitude towards hip-hop. It's really pushing the genre forward and experimenting with it. It's not the most groundbreaking album in that world, but LP is probably the most fun and clear example of that. Finally, I have Magdalena Bay's Imaginal Disc. I first compiled this list of albums a few months ago, and in that time, Imaginal Disc has risen to the 101st spot on this list, so it'll be on there in no time. Being less than a year out from the album's release, it's hard to know how it'll age, but I think it's already proven itself to be one of the most creative and exciting pop albums of at least the last 10 years. It's great to see that it's been so universally loved because I think Magdalena Bay absolutely deserve it. And that's all I have for this video. I'm happy to be done with this project as it has taken up so much of my time. Still, I had a great time listening through all these albums. I got to re-listen to some albums that I probably wouldn't have otherwise, and I got to hear some new albums that I never heard. I'd love to hear what your favorite albums on the list are, and if you made it here, thank you so much for watching. I know this is a really long one. that's all I have for now. I'll probably be back in a few years.